Now, good evening. How are you folks doing tonight? Thank you so much for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Matthew Jockers. He's been quite successful in his academic career. He's received a bachelor's from Montana State University, a master's degree from Northern Colorado, and a PhD from Southern Illinois in Irish Studies. Dr. Jockers is currently a faculty member at Stanford University, working as an academic technology specialist within the Department of English. This position requires Dr. Jockers to serve as a consultant to the English department and work with other faculty members to help leverage technology for research and teaching. He does some fascinating work in taking patterns of writings and determine whether certain authors wrote certain books based upon the patterns of the writing. It's really fascinating work. Outside of his busy life as a college professor, he enjoys a number of outdoor activities such as rock climbing and more recently LSD, which stands for long, slow distance running. So I thought I'd wake you up there, right? Say, okay, this guy really is going to be interesting, isn't he? But no, he does this ultra slow, long, slow distance running, which is what I do all the time anyway, but you actually do it at 50 miles a clip. And he's done several marathons, but he's also done these, what I'll call these ultra marathons, which are like 50 miles or longer. So he says he completes those in about 10 hours, so he runs a long time. He's also an accomplished rugby player as well, so he's a very fascinating guy. He's here to speak to us about an inspirational book that he introduced entitled Kansas Irish. We're delighted to have Dr. Jockers with us tonight to share his passion and knowledge, so please join me in giving him a warm Benedictine College welcome. Dr. Jockers.
Wow, it's a big stage. All right. Well, I want to begin by talking about the day I had today and thanking a number of people. And I'll start with John Bunch, Dr. Bunch, and Dr. Young, and Dr. Vanderlock. And I'm told he just goes by Dr. Mark because no one could say his name. For showing me around and showing me the fine hospitality, and President Minnis as well, and Sharon McCourt for helping set all of this up, and also Joe, the student whose last name I missed, but who took me around campus today and showed me what a neat place you have here. But I also want to thank just the general community here, which has shown me just such a warm welcome. And I mean that from the people I pass in the sidewalk to the people I've actually talked to. So living in the secular world as I do, I feel compelled to begin by a confession in good Catholic tradition and say that I'm something of a lapsed Catholic, or perhaps better to say a major holidays Catholic. But it's been a breath of fresh air being here today, immersed in this community of Catholics. And in many ways, I've been reminded of why I have always admired the Catholic educational tradition. It really is a wonderful thing that's going on here in Kansas. And I've only been here a day, and I think I can say that with some assurity. And this brings me more or less directly to my subject, and that is that one cannot understand Kansas Irish, the book, without also some understanding of what it meant to be Irish and Catholic in the 19th century Midwest. I'm just going to put my clock on here so I don't go crazy. Sorry about that. I am probably best described as a literary historian, so I need to start with what I know and hopefully tell you a little bit about what I've learned. But what I'm not going to do is to tell you what I've written in the introduction to the book, which has just come out from Rofont Press in Wichita. This is a reprinting of this memoir by Charles Driscoll titled Kansas Irish. You can get a copy of the book if you like, or there'll be some for sale after the lecture, and you can read the essay there if you like. But instead of rehashing what I've written there, I'd like to sort of contextualize Charles Driscoll's book in the context of more information about the Irish in Kansas, but also in the Midwest in general. And as I said, I'm a literary historian, so my focus will tend to be on the literary aspects. In 1979, not long ago, William Shannon, an Irish studies scholar, wrote in the preface to Daniel Casey and Robert Rhodes's very important collection of essays on Irish American fiction. He wrote that the collection, and now I need this new clicker that you've given me. There it is. He wrote that the collection examined the whole ground of the Irish American experience and demonstrated the scope and variety of the Irish community's experience in the United States. Now, Shannon's enthusiasm for this collection was in keeping with its significance. It was an important collection, but his remarks about the breadth are misleading. An examination of the collection, in fact, reveals not a comprehensive study, but rather a study of Irish American authors centered primarily in the eastern urban locations such as New York and Boston. Writers from the Great Plains are totally absent, and thus the collection misses the whole ground of the Irish American literary experience by about 1,800,692 square miles. Now, this neglect is surprising given the critical attention that the Irish in the West have received from historians. And while it's true that most historical studies have also focused on places like Boston and New York, since at least the 70s, there's been an effort underway to chronicle the Irish beyond the Mississippi. By 1977, Patrick Blessing, a California scholar, had pointed out that the current view of the Irish had been painted rather gloomily by historians focusing too much on cities like Boston. You know, for example, these stories that the Irish pioneered the New York ghettos. These were the first ghettos, were the Irish ghettos. At the same time, scholarly opinion of the Irish in America was still geographically biased. Blessing's study of Irish migration to California, however, forced reconsideration of these views. And as part of his argument, Blessing cited census figures from the 19th century, and he was able to point out something that others had been unwilling to admit, and that's that in many cases the Irish were in fact the dominant ethnic groups in the West. They were the largest ethnic group in Minnesota, Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming, Montana, Arizona, and Washington, and the second largest in Utah, Idaho, Oregon, and Dakota. In fact, by 1850, 22% of the Irish in America were no longer on the eastern seaboard, and by 1880, that had risen to 36%. So the question, of course, is where did they go? Well, in addition to land, and we'll get back to that in just a second, they were attracted to the prospect of mineral riches. The gold and silver rushes of the 1850s and the discoveries of copper in Butte, Montana in the 80s led to these massive migrations of Irish immigrants. Coupled with the realities of the famine, this horrible hunger that's going on in Ireland at the same time, there was the lure of American freedom, the prospect of riches, and this led these Irish not just to Boston and New York, but to take what was called the second ship across the prairies to the mountains. Sometimes they were prompted by relatives who had gone before them. Other times they sailed directly around South America and came into California. In the mining camps of the Rocky Mountains, the Irish met with comparative success compared to the Irish ghettos of New York. According to Montana historian David Emmons, the opportunities for the Irish were so great in Butte, Montana, that one Irishman wrote home and urged his countrymen, "Don't stop in the United States, come right on out to Butte." In Colorado, the Irish immigrants were prospering in the many mines that were scattered throughout the central region of the state. Evelyn Walsh McLean was the daughter of Irish immigrant parents, and in her memoir titled "Father Struck It Rich," she recounts the story of how her father made out in Colorado. She writes at one point that Leadville, Colorado was a place where to all America and beyond, it was the one spot where a man or woman might hope to win a fortune overnight. Her father discovered what became the renowned Camp Bird mine in Ouray, Colorado, and he went on to become one of the wealthiest men in the West. And by the way, Evelyn Walsh McLean was the last private owner of the 45-carat Hope Diamond and the last owner of the 92-carat Star of the East. So they did all right. But enough about the mountains and the rocks. What about the wheat and the corn? Speaking of the agricultural opportunities of the Great Plains, John Francis Maguire was convinced in 1869 that the land was the grand resource for the Irish immigrant, as well as his safest and surest means of advancement. Inside this great mass of the American frontier, Maguire argued that, quote, little was necessary to enable the humble man to make a home for himself and his children. Now, of course, this conclusion is rather dramatically inconsistent with what we know of the experiences of nearly all immigrants to the plains, but especially to the Irish. Maguire was an optimist. The truth is that many Irish families moved onto the plains and did achieve moderate degree of success, but the price they paid for their success was often high and often paid in terms of lost religion, lost ethnic identity, loneliness, and separation from loved ones in Ireland or on the East Coast. So Irish-American writers in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century Midwest, like other mainstream writers, consistently portray the prairie as a difficult and lonely world. Unlike their non-Irish contemporaries, writers such as Willa Cather and Ole Verag, these Irish authors explore prairie life from a uniquely Irish and uniquely Irish Catholic perspective, emphasizing in this the effects that the environment had on men and women who were transported from the green hills of Ireland to the sometimes brown prairies of America. The earliest works in this tradition, like Maguire's, read earlier, tend to be more positive and to reflect a sense of the West as a utopian place where fortunes are made and men are transformed for the better. For Father Henry Lemke, not Irish, but someone whom I think you will all know, this was a similar case. He wrote in an early letter that Donovan, Kansas was, quote, both beautiful and fruitful. Water and wood is in abundance, and the climate is healthful. You will not easily find the like in any part of the world. Now, as you know, Father Henry's life did not turn out to be simple. No doubt you have all heard the story of a particularly bad winter and a walk in which he was ready to give up and prayed to the Blessed Virgin and then saw the light in a small settler's cabin. I can't speak to Father Henry's view of Kansas as an Eden, but it's my contention that these more positive portraits painted by early Irish writers were done so in large part because they are written in the immediate wake of the Great Famine. It's hard to see. The picture in the upper corner, though, is a famine shanty picture of a family. Compared to rural Ireland at the time, rural Kansas probably did look like Eden. But as time passes, the accounts of these pioneer priests and Irish-American writers such as Kate Cleary from Nebraska and Josephine Donovan in Iowa and Charles Hayes and Charles Driscoll of Kansas become more realistic perspectives of Irish life on the prairie. The fact is that despite having come from an agrarian past, the Irish were not prepared for dryland farming. Charles Hayes, another Kansas Irish author, explores how the rigors of farm life eventually tear apart the Hardin family of his novel, The Four Winds. Edward McCourt, a Canadian Irish writer from the Canadian Midwest, writes of a character, Nora, an Irish immigrant woman who is driven to near madness by the emptiness of the prairie. And Roy Morrison's story of the isolation of eastern Colorado eventually drives his female protagonist to suicide. Indeed, even in the more positive portrayals of Irish success, and there are more than a few, there remains an omnipresent background of toil and suffering. The story of Florence, or Big Flurry, Driscoll, which is told in Charles Driscoll's Kansas Irish, is one of the success stories. But material success comes at a price. These are not simple stories, but to a large degree, they are real stories. But let's trace the evolution of Irish perspectives on Kansas from the beginning with the poet, essayist, and priest, Thomas Ambrose Butler, for whom I've read Butler County, Kansas is named, but then I saw something that contradicted that, and it said that it was Butler City, Kansas, but I can't find such a place. But nevertheless, Thomas Ambrose Butler was in Kansas, and he described the place as a literal utopia for Irish exiles. He was born in Dublin, 1837, but when his radical efforts to help the Irish poor got him into trouble, he immigrated to America and headed directly to Kansas, where it was said that he had some friends. After establishing himself in Kansas, he continued to agitate against Irish oppression, and he often found ways of linking Kansas with Ireland. In his 1871 booklet titled The State of Kansas and Irish Immigration, he outlines both his thoughts on the current state of affairs in the Old Sod, or on the Old Sod, and his high opinion of the prospects available to Irish immigrants in Kansas. There is but one class in Ireland, he writes, which I am well aware has no other resource left but immigration. I allude, of course, to the unhappy farmers who become victims of eviction. An Irish farmer cast in accordance with the cruel laws that crush him, out upon the wayside with his family, deprived of the home and lands of his fathers, turns his tearful eyes towards the far west. To such I say, with heartfelt sympathy, hesitate not. If you have health and strength and money enough to bring you out, come to the great free country, where you may soon grow rich and independent as a farmer, with the yellow corn waving upon the breasts of the prairie, and cattle grazing upon the hill, and no master over you but the great Lord of heaven and earth. So Butler assures his readers, and his readers are meant to be Irish, that the state is not overrun by wild Indians. He does this literally. He notes, in fact, that the majority of the savages have been pushed to the far northern corners of the state, and that those who remain are likely to bear Celtic names of O'Brien and McCarthy, and to have been born of Indian mothers and had good Irishmen for fathers. He explains how it was a government policy to grant Indians and their children 160 acres of land, an opportunity that was not lost upon the Irish, who were induced to link their life, this is quoting, induced to link their life in the matrimonial bond to Indian maidens. And lest his Irish readers should shudder at the thought of good Irish Catholic boys marrying savage brides, he adds that, quote, Indian maidens are as good looking as Irish girls. Now, I discovered in reading Kansas Monks today, that was loaned to me by Miriam O'Hare, that Butler was not just making this stuff up. Speaking of the Catholic families he encountered, Father Henry Lemke writes of finding, quote, half Indian, half Irish Catholics among his very first parishioners. Back to Butler. Butler's visiting Leavenworth, and he writes, about 1/6 or 4,000 are Irish Catholics and the children of Irish. The sheriff of the city is an Irishman. The deputy treasurer is an Irishman. The market master, the weighmaster, many of the foremost lawyers, and some of the city police are sons of the old sod. A great many saloon keepers and shopkeepers are Irish, and a stranger from the Emerald Isle might read such Celtic names on showboards as Phelan, Whalen, Casey, McCarthy, Cooney, and he goes on. It's also worth noting that the very first cornerstone of the campus on which we're standing now, when it was laid on May 29th, 1859, the oration that day was read by an Irish priest, Father McGee, who was then stationed in Lawrence. Of the remoter regions of the state, Butler was equally sanguine. In one particularly rural location, which he doesn't identify, he writes of being struck by the beautiful pastoral appearance of the surrounding country. For miles away, nothing is to be seen but the green fields that seem like great waves belted in by a shining river, along whose banks tall trees stand in close line. After I had gazed for some time upon the beautiful scene, I was almost inclined to believe myself back once again and to one of the Wicklow Mountains and looking down on the plains of Kildare. In this particular rural location of Kansas, Butler also notes finding 50 Irish families living happily. So he was an essayist, he was a priest, he was a poet. He writes of Kansas, out here on the beautiful prairies, the scene is delightfully grand, for signs of the richest fertility cover the face of the land. My children may hap in the future beside this lone home in the West. Some heartbroken exiles of Erin may seek for a shelter and rest. Some other lone wanderers settle on the prairies as rich as our own, till round on the wild a new Ireland of beauty and power shall be grown. So he was not a great poet, but he was an enthusiastic one, to be sure. Or perhaps it's better to say idealistic and maybe overzealous. How overzealous becomes clear when we read the work of Kate Cleary. Writing contemporary to Butler and just 150 miles to the northwest of Leavenworth in Nebraska, Kate McPhalen Cleary provides a more realistic portrait of the prairie experience. In addition to the daily hardships of agricultural life on the plains, Cleary's fictionalized renderings of the people of the plains provide us with a specifically feminine dimension. The plains experience, as other American writers such as Willa Cather and Mari Sandows have shown, was particularly difficult on women. And these were women who were frequently brought to the West rather than choosing to go to the West. And such was the case with Cleary herself. Her husband moved her from a comfortable home in Chicago to Nebraska in 1884. Cleary's experiences on the plains would be bittersweet. It was the plains that fueled her best and most important work, but her writing is filled with sadness, isolation, and suffering. Despite the demands of 6 children and the loneliness of the plains, or perhaps because of them, Cleary produced compelling prose which captures the taste and the tone of the Nebraska prairie in ways that I can't describe. More graphically than any other Irish-American writer in the region, Cleary captures the barren seclusion of the Western Plains. And by focusing on its effect on women, she inaugurates a tradition of similar stories, stories which will chronicle how Irish women face the difficult life on the American plains. Arriving in Nebraska in 1884, Cleary is a pioneer in many senses of the word. She is a prairie wife, she is an Irish-American in the West, and she is a woman writing serious fiction. Despite a short and troubled life, she was a groundbreaking and important figure in the history of women's literature in America. And she is equally important as one of Irish Americans' first literary success stories. Though she was never rich, she made a living as a writer, and her work was published across the country in such prestigious magazines as McClure's, but also in the less literary but very, very popular Good Housekeeping. To some, Cleary could easily be referred to as the grandmother of American realistic women's fiction. She demonstrated that a woman could build fiction out of real life, and that such fiction need not spring solely from the urban world that was the center of so much other realistic fiction of this day. And I must note that Cleary's not always bleak, and Nebraska is not always bleak. She does write primarily in this realistic mode, treating female life on the prairie, but she also wrote some humorous sketches and stories that took sort of the lighter side of the plains life. And I think in this regard, she was typically Irish. Just a few miles east and at about the same time, Josephine Donovan's parents arrived in Granville, Iowa, much in the manner that Cleary had arrived. And like Cleary before her, Donovan chose to fictionalize her experience of female life on the plains. And her one novel is titled Black Soil, and when you go to Granville and see this sign, it's not referring to the dirt, it's referring to that novel. When the protagonist of Black Soil, Nell is her name, when she arrives at the plot of land that was to become their home, the narrator writes that a loneliness seized her, the fear that had haunted her on the train as every revolution of the wheels carried them further west took possession of her again and made determination give way to bodily fatigue. Throughout the story, Donovan explores the plains experience from the perspective of this Irish-American woman. And while she is more positive than Cleary, Donovan's novel is not a formulaic rags-to-riches story, nor does it present an idealized portrait of what it means to be Irish in the West. On the contrary, Donovan juxtaposes optimism and idealism of the previous McGuire and Butler generation with the stark reality of the plains. And in doing this, she provides not so much a cautionary tale as a chronicle of how preconceived notions of life on the plains that were laid in place by the likes of Butler and McGuire are quickly and painfully replaced with firsthand experience. In the opening pages of the novel, as the Connors approach their new 160-acre homestead, Nell describes the place as a paradise of flowers. She writes, "Stretches of blue, patches of pink beckoned to them. They were making a road through flowers, tramping them down, rolling over them, going along and crushing down more. It was a world of flowers." And this Eden-esque language culminates when Nell's husband, Tim, presents his impressions of Kansas. He says, of Iowa. "This is the finest 160 acres in the West." And when the children express their concerns about not having any neighbors, Tim assures them that as a substitute for a community of friends, they will hunt the fairies, because surely there must be hundreds of them hiding underneath these flowers. The irony, of course, is that this land of flowers is really a land of weeds that must be plowed under in order to become a farm where growing marketable crops is far more difficult than wildflowers. And the fantasy is soon replaced by reality, and the harshness of the isolation is ultimately too powerful for the fairies that Tim conjures from his Irish past. Not long after voicing her adoration of the flowers, even Nell comes to realize the magnitude of what she's gotten herself into. When another wagon passes by heading east, she wants to run out and call after him, "Take me back, take me back." But Nell eventually does overcome her anxiety about the plains, but not without some cost. In moving west, she sacrifices the society of other women, and she sacrifices her ethnic community, her independence, her domestic aspirations, and to a large extent, her religious devotion. It is the nature of both Catholicism in particular and Irish culture in general to be communal. In Ireland, communal allegiances are frequently, if not absolutely, defined in terms of village and county. And in the more urban American East, the parish serves that similar end, defining Irish American society and ethnic solidarity. In the absence of these structures in the American desert, maintaining ethnic identity and preserving cultural values becomes increasingly difficult. And as the keepers of the faith, the Irish women, the mothers in particular, find the Midwest especially challenging. Without the reinforcements of an established parish community and the regularity of Sunday service, communion, and the various obligations of the church, these Irish women, such as those that Cleary and Donovan depict, watch as both ethnic and religious identity fade into the brown, homogeneous landscape. Well, that's a sour note. Set in Kansas between the wars, to get really sour now, a little dust bowl. Set between the wars, Charles Hayes' 1942 novel, The Four Winds, focuses on an Irish family's struggle to make ends meet. And unlike Donovan's novel of hardship overcome, The Four Winds is a story of failed adjustment and inability to adapt Irish and Irish Catholic perspectives to life on the plains. The Hardin family's strong Catholic devotion is markedly Irish, provincial, and even superstitious. As in other Irish American novels, the family's religious devotion is centered around the mother. And throughout the novel, her religious convictions and unanswered faith provide an ironic backdrop to the decaying life of the family. Her prayers are never answered, and though she strains her knees on the parlor floor nightly, the family is struck by one hardship after another. Poor crops, unrelenting poverty, cause them to lose one farm after another in a series of evictions that echo the famine years in Ireland. The Hardins gradually lose their livestock, their possessions, and they lose them to the banker who they once thought of as a friend. And compounding the bleakness and the desperate poverty, the familial relationships within the family begin to deteriorate, especially those between father and son and mothers and daughters. And as the book goes on, friends and neighbors lose touch with each other, and the tight fabric of shared isolation, if you know what I mean, that tight fabric that frequently held families on the plains together, knowing that your neighbor was only 40 miles away. begins to tear up as well. And Mr. Hardin laments the loss of the old days when neighbors visited each other and helped each other out in times of need. They're leaving. This is what they're facing. Unlike Donovan's novel, which takes place just prior to the turn of the century, this is a novel set during the Dust Bowl era of the 30s. The soil is no longer black, and the agrarian life holds little promise. The opportunities of the West are no longer in Kansas. And so Gene, the young boy in the story, at the end of the novel, we see him heading west to find greener pastures and leave behind this wasteland that was his father's generation. So located somewhere between the absolute bleakness of Charles Hayes's The Four Winds and the tempered optimism of Josephine Donovan's Black Soil lies Charles Driscoll's 1943 memoir, Kansas Irish. Driscoll, like those before him, is also concerned with realistically portraying Irish life on the plains, and he achieves a high degree of success with this, in large part because he writes a memoir drawing on personal experiences. Kansas Irish is the first of three memoirs that Driscoll would write of his life. The second is titled Country Jake, and the third, East and West of Wichita, was never published, but I got a copy of this manuscript from his heirs, and we're now publishing all three of these books. So Kansas Irish is out now. We'll have Country Jake within a year, and then the third book. But Kansas Irish is set in the late 1880s, and it chronicles specifically the life of Driscoll's father, Big Flurry, or Florence Driscoll, and how he leaves Ireland in his 20s and sets out to make a life as a farmer on the American prairie. Early reviewers of the book praised Driscoll for recreating an authentic Kansas atmosphere and for showing farm life candidly with all of its difficulties and its rewards. Peter Wellman of the Saturday Review of Literature called specific attention to how the conflicts and contrasts between Hibernian Catholicism and blue-nosed Kansas Protestantism made Kansas Irish a diverting book to read. And he adds that by bringing together two inharmonious subjects, the state of Kansas and the Irish, Driscoll created an arresting effect. Wellman was perceptive, and he was the only reviewer among a dozen who drew attention to the apparent peculiarity of yoking Kansas with Irish. He points out that both subjects are ones that generate perennial curiosity, but he adds, quote, "To the average mind, Kansas is the abode of transplanted Cape Codders, and not the sort of place one would expect to find the family of an Irish immigrant." So the background of conventional wisdom that's informing Wellman's observations about the average mind and the apparent absurdity of finding the Irish in Kansas is consistent with the general trend that I began with of neglecting the West when it comes to considering the Irish in America. Stated simply, finding the Irish in America was something of, in Kansas was something of a surprise. Those of you who know and who are from Kansas know that this isn't necessarily true, that there's Irish all over. So Kansas Irish, the book, opens with a description of Florence Driscoll in 1883. Big Flurry, I'm quoting, was 47 years old in the hot, dry summer of '83 when he cleared a spot where he was to make his second attempt to establish a Kansas farm home. His first attempt is recounted a few pages later. We learn that he had bought 160 acres from another Irishman, Pat Whaley. Turns out the land is no good, and Whaley took him for a ride, but rather than doubting a countryman, he goes right back to Whaley and gets a second parcel, and in the second case, it ends up being fertile ground. So 1883 is a time that's parallel to Donovan's novel, Black Soil in Iowa, and it predates the Dust Bowl period of the Four Winds. And in this context, we understand that success is certainly possible, and that the forces in the story which yield success are individual and not environmental. Flurry, however, Big Flurry, knows nothing about farming. As the author tells us, he was Florence Driscoll, born of fishing and seafaring folk on Long Island in the Bay of Roaring Water near Cape Clear in County Cork, Ireland. In all manners, Flurry advocates the use of muscle rather than cunning to get the work done. He struggles with his farm throughout the book, and he often uses methods that are more inclined to make you sweat, and he leverages boy power, and he, in all of this, manages to make a moderate living as a farmer. In the end, however, it's really only a material success, and it's not able to satisfy Fleury's emotional and spiritual needs. Like Black Soil, which opens by emphasizing the cultural and geographical gaps between the American prairie and Kansas, the American prairie and Ireland, Kansas Irish juxtaposes images of Ireland to heighten the disparity between the two places. So after presenting the Kansas setting of Fleury toiling, we flash back to Ireland, where we see Florence as a young boy dreaming of success in the American West. But dreams aside, the primary motivation for his immigration is he has this tyrannical father. And when Florence finally makes up his mind to leave, his father makes no attempt to stop him, and instead the father wonders, well, I wonder if he'll do well enough to take some of the others over, which was actually a common immigration pattern. The horrible irony of the story is that Fleury leaves to escape his tyrannical father and turns into his tyrannical father. And though he achieves a certain degree of financial success, he never sheds his own father's stingy and tyrannical ways, and he just is really hard on his sons. Well, having saved $6 American, he sets out for Cork City. Along the way, they tell him, oh, don't believe the stories you've been told about gold to pick up in the streets, and he has no misunderstanding of that. He knows that it's going to be hard work. He arrives in America and moves to Erie, Pennsylvania, where he works like so many other Irish for a time. He meets another Irish-American woman. They marry. She's not real keen on the idea, but her mother is. And they eventually move to Kansas. Periods of relative prosperity follow while the family never really becomes rich. There are periods of more poverty than others. But they are able to pay their bills and, more importantly, to provide for their children. All the while, though, Fleury grows consistently more and more discontent with life in America. He achieves what he set out to do. The life of a farmer, though, doesn't satisfy him, and he yearns to return to Ireland, where he feels that he would fit in. He's never able to accept what he calls the vanity of a comfortable existence. So because of this notion of vanity, he makes life really hard on the family. He refuses to buy a seat for the plow, arguing that a man should be able to walk behind his plow. And then funny, late in the book, he does buy a seated plow, and the first thing he does is go out and remove the seat and sell it to the junk dealer in Wichita. This world that he creates is particularly hard on his wife, Ellen. He insists that the pump should be at least 100 yards from the house, because it would be vanity to have it closer to the house. Finally, some years later, he moves it to 50 feet within the house, but that's as close as it's going to get. The tension builds, and as a result of the tension, the family finally breaks down, and Fleury, who was once a man of temperance, turns to drinking and anger and frustration. And at one particular point, the family decides to have a party, and Big Fleury just can't take it that people are having fun. He doesn't understand it's a masquerade party, which he really finds ridiculous, and he yells, "Woman, I'm going back to Ireland. Give me $1,000, woman, so I can go back where they don't dress up like the archbishops to dance a waltz." A series of tirades follow this, and the family gets together and they decide that he must go back to Ireland. And so they mortgage the farm. They get him, I think, $1,000. And the last scene of Kansas Irish is Big Fleury literally walking away back to Ireland and leaving the family forever. But at the end of Kansas Irish, anyhow, that's what we're led to believe, that he's avoided his misery and perhaps full-blown insanity by escaping back to Ireland. But the end of Kansas Irish, of course, is not the end of the story. And as I said earlier, the author followed this with two other books, Country Jake and East and West of Wichita. Country Jake is published in 1946. And in Country Jake, we learn that Big Flurry did indeed return to Ireland. But the big Irishman's return was not all that he or readers of Kansas Irish expected. 18 months passed in this paradise, Driscoll writes, and then the atmosphere palled upon the native son who had spent his lifetime in the active, surging, prosperous land beyond the water. Big Flurry had not found in Ireland the solace that he sought, and he once more packed his sea chest and bade the island farewell. 67 now, and a little more stooped, Big Flurry returned to Wichita and bought a small farm west of town, and he raised garden truck for the local market. This in itself is an incredible story, a story of repatriation and then re-immigration. This did not happen much in the history of Irish immigration. So in the end, even the inhospitable and lonely plains were better than poverty-stricken Ireland. The dream of America that Flurry had nurtured in his youth proved to be stronger and more real than the idealized portrait of Ireland that he'd created as an adult on the plains of Kansas. For Big Flurry's children, however, the dream of success that the early writers like Francis Maguire and Thomas Butler were writing about did come true. Big Flurry's eldest son, by the way, Van, was addicted to education. You thought I was going to say something else. He was addicted to education, and this, of course, was one of the things that his father hated about him, and he never ended tormenting him about reading. That was a terrible thing to do. But by the end of the second book, Country Jake, we discover that Van is leaving home to come to St. Benedict's. So he walked these halls, maybe not these halls here, but he walked these halls, Charles' older brother. Charles was also successful, probably much more successful. At the age of 20, he earned a scholarship and he left the farm to go to school. He'd received little formal schooling before that. His father wouldn't allow it. And what he did get, though, was largely a result of his own secretive efforts to do so. He read as often as he could, and he went to great length to conceal this ambition from his father. We learn in Country Jake that he would seek chores out on the farm where he would be far enough away that he could read secretly. And then he developed this sacrilegious practice of tearing the pages out of the books and releasing them into the wind so that he wouldn't get caught with a book. And it was a disposable book. By the time he was a teenager, he had worked his way through most all of the popular literature in the Wichita Library. And in all likelihood, it was Treasure Island that was the most influential book he ever read. Reading Stevenson fueled his passion for books, but it also sparked in Driscoll what became a lifelong fascination with pirates, of all things. And as an adult, Driscoll collected a sea of materials related to piracy. The New York Times recorded Driscoll's conviction that, quote, "the best way to hunt treasure is to write about it." And he did write about piracy extensively. His published books on the subject include Doubloons, The Story of Buried Treasure, Treasure Abroad, Driscoll's Book of Pirates, and Pirates Ahoy. By his own estimate, Driscoll had, at the age of 50, written more words on the subject of piracy than anyone else in the world. This was a somewhat ironic distinction for a second-generation Irish-American farmer who grew up 1,500 miles from the nearest ocean. The picture on the right is the brochure of the Christie's auction house that auctioned off his collection just a few years ago, and the money was all donated to the Wichita Library. Driscoll himself left the farm in 1908 to attend Lewis Academy. Didn't come here. He wasn't as disciplined as his brother Van. But Lewis Academy was a reputable Kansas prep school, and he excelled in writing while he was there. And from there, he went on to Friends University, where he graduated at the age of 27. And after college, he began a 39-year career in journalism, first as a staff reporter at the Wichita Eagle. He eventually worked his way up to editor, and then he moved to Yonkers, New York, where he became executive editor at the McNaught Syndicate. And from 1938 to 1951, he wrote a regular column called New York Day by Day. In New York, Driscoll was extremely well-liked. He was known as a kind and honest man with a good sense of humor. and among his friends were the literary critic H.L. Mencken and the syndicated columnist Rube Goldberg of the famous Rube Goldberg machines. With the former, Mencken, he carried on a long correspondence. The letters are kept in the University of Kansas. And with Goldberg, he bore a striking resemblance. And before his daughter died, I had the good fortune to interview her on a couple of occasions, and she told me some good inside stories. According to his daughter, Charles and Goldberg would often impersonate each other when traveling up and down the elevator at the Times building. People would say, "Oh, good morning, Mr. Goldberg." And Dad, I'm quoting his daughter, and Dad would carry on a fine conversation. And Goldberg would do the same thing when he was addressed as Mr. Driscoll. But even after moving to New York and becoming a man of the world, Driscoll stayed in touch with his roots, both Kansas and Irish. When he wrote his column, and his daughter told me this, it was always, she said, with the Kansas folks in mind. And it turns out the column was a particular favorite with the Kansas people, and he received tons and tons of fan mail from folks in the Midwest. As an adult, he traveled to Ireland on several occasions. He visited the birthplace of his father, but he was never, as his daughter said, a professional Irishman. He was proud of his ancestry, both rural American and Irish. And his Kansas-Irish trilogy is as much about the one as it is about the other. It is about Kansas, it is about Irish, and what he felt was important. So I want to end by, again, thanking everyone for this evening and note my particular gratitude to the college for their hospitality, and also to Pat O'Connor at Rofont Press, who was able to take on the republication of these 3 books. Individually, each of these books is important, but together they represent what is the most extensive and complete chronicle of Irish life in the Midwest. Thank you.
Anybody have any questions?
Yes.
I have an interesting quote, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I have a quote that was sent to me about, this is in the second book of the Driscoll trilogy, Country Jake. And it says, the Courtneys, that must be a family friend of the Driscolls, is that right?
Yes.
The Courtneys occupied only one pew in church, but they occupied all of it at every Mass on Sunday and most weekday services. The oldest Courtney boy, Ed, was younger than I. Ed Courtney was just starting to school at a place called St. Benedictine College, a misnomer at that time since it was merely a prep school. Like so many Western schools, it was named in hope and cradled in ambition, and many years later it did become a college. Ed was what modern collegians call marks happy. He boasted about his marks, his phenomenal progress in school, his tender age in the light of such accomplishments, and his stand-in with the school authorities. He marveled that Van Driscoll, Van and I were not in school. While Van could scarcely endure Ed and his boasting, he was anxious to talk to him about the school, and in these conversations made up his mind that he would go to St. Benedict's if possible. He liked the idea of monastic seclusion as an atmosphere for study. He had so much time to make up that he would need to study hard and continuously. St. Benedict's played no extramural games of any kind and did not stress athletics. Van talked to Mother and John about St. Benedict's, got the Courtneys to talk to them. Soon, on Courtney's suggestion, there appeared at the farm a bearded monk of modest mien, Father Andrew. He was a scout for the school. He brought a catalog, an extensive outline of the course of studies, and Van and I ate up these words from the monastic house of learning. Van Driscoll attended school there in 1906 or 1907, and then there's more of this in the 3rd book of the trilogy, East and West of Wichita. So I thought you folks would be interested in that little plug there from St. Benedict's in his 2nd book. But
The thing about sports, the little note about sports was important because Van was not athletic, and he didn't want to go anywhere where he was going to have to do athletics. So
oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, have to how times have changed here. We're honored to have you, Dr. Jockers. I want to give you a gift that you can take back to California, and you're welcome back anytime. We would love to have you again.